I'm very pleased to chair this current panel. There are three good friends and great scholars, Marlene Laruelle, Scott Radnitz, and Eric McGlinchey, whom I've known for a long time. They're very good friends of the larger Central Asia academic community as well as the U.S. government, and by that I mean that it doesn't mean that their views, they always agree with what the U.S. government does, but they're never afraid to share their thoughts, which are always very profound and well-informed. And not only that, they do it often and are very willing to engage at any time to share their thoughts. So I'm David Abramson. I work at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. I'm the Uzbekistan and Tajikistan analyst. I've been there since 2005. All of our bios are in the attached, the program that you have on your tables. So I won't go through their many accomplishments and publications other than to make the comments that I just did. But we'd like to start, first of all, with Marlene Laruelle, and we'll proceed on down in the order that we're seated. So please, Marlene.
Thank you, David. I will be discussing today what the Central Asians consider their main issue now, and which maybe we don't, but they do, which is the current situation in Russia, especially economically, and how it is impacting their own situation. So let me begin by saying that contrary to what has really been the kind of mainstream narrative in DC since several years, the country in the region that really influenced the future of Central Asia, it's not Afghanistan, it's still Russia. We want it or we are happy or unhappy with that, but that's still the case. There are really no spillover coming from Afghanistan. There are more than spillover coming from Russia in Central Asia. So the fate of Central Asia is still largely shaped not by Russia, but by what is going on in Russia, and that's a little bit different. And that's the case for several reasons. The first one is the obvious kind of geopolitical, strategic power of Russia in the region. The second one is that we have been largely underestimating the cultural interaction going on between Central Asia and Russia. And I think continuing presenting that as a kind of Soviet legacy is a mistake. This legacy has been totally updated by Russia since 4 to 5 years. And the ability of the Russians to invest money, to invest brain, to invest the best they can produce in terms of creating a new information world in which the Central Asians are living are really something that we have been largely underestimating. And Russia is now really the kind of creator of narrative for Central Asia, and that's something that will be very difficult for other countries to compete with, especially for the US, knowing that the State Department has been generous enough to create one, not 2 or 3, but one new grant to produce Russian-speaking media to try to counterbalance the Russian one. So we are very far away. And the third reason, which will be the one I will be discussing here, is that Russia is still a security provider in Central Asia, not because it has 2 military bases, but because it's the one providing jobs. And here it's a narrative we should be sensitive to, because we also consider in the US that providing jobs is a security issue. And that's the case in Central Asia. And that's really one of the key elements of Russian influence in the region, and that's totally kind of shaken by what is going on with the economic crisis in Russia. So let me move to that now. As Jeff mentioned during the discussion, more than 50% of the Tajik GDP is based on remittances, about 1/3 of the Kyrgyz GDP, 15% of the Uzbek GDP are done by remittances. You have more than 3 million Uzbek working in Russia, 1 million Tajik, about 500,000 Kyrgyz, Azeri, Armenian, Moldovan. So it's really something which is very important. The Russian migration policy has been changing a lot since January 1st, and we are still sometimes hesitating in interpreting if things are changing because of the new migration policy or because of the economic crisis. We always complain that Russia is not a liberal country. Well, Russia is very liberal in terms of its migration policy. The problem is that it's so corrupt that being liberal or illiberal doesn't matter anymore. It's just a corrupt system, which means that you don't have any real policy able to function. Russia is not really interested in trying to control migration at the border for several reasons. First, because they are realistic. You cannot really stop the flow of people on the 7,000-kilometer border with Kazakhstan. Also because of the Eurasian Economic Union, the Russian elites are still, or at least part of them, are still committed to free movement of population. And that's something really important that we need to remember, is that everybody in Russia, all the public opinion and the majority of the decision maker are in favor of introducing a visa regime with the Central Asian state. And the only one that still refuse that are more or less two people, Putin and Glaziev. And they are kind of standing in maintaining this idea that the Eurasian Economic Union will have a free movement of population. And the third element is that the border, the symbolic border of Russia are blurry. So trying to have a migration policy that will be working at the border, would that mean working at the border between Russia and Kazakhstan, or at the border of the Eurasian Economic Union between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and then after Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, or at the border of the security kind of perception of Russia? In that case, that would be the kind of CSTO border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. So, and very difficult for Russia to control migration at the border. So the Russian migration policy is really focusing at controlling the role of migrants in the job market. And since 2013, Russia has passed 11 new laws in terms of its migration policy, trying to manage that. It went from a quota system to what they call a patent system. And I will not give you too many details, but the main element to remember is that now legalization of migrants is under the responsibility of the migrants themselves and no more of the employers, which is not a good news, neither for migrants, neither for the fight against corruption in Russia. It means that migrants are themselves responsible for their own self-legalization with the Russian administrative system, which means that more of them will have to go in the shadow economy because it will be impossible for them to fulfill the administrative mandatory element that the system is on the paper asking for. The good news, if I may say, is that things are so corrupt that, for example, getting the exam of Russian language and culture that is now mandatory to be legalized since January 1st was already on sale in December. So thanks to corruption, it will still possible for several millions of migrants to try to legalize themselves. Another big issue is that Russia has been blacklisting 1.1 million of migrants for very minor administrative violation, which means that you have 1 million people who cannot officially enter Russia anymore, and that's 250,000 of Tajiks, which is just a huge number for Tajikistan. We have contradictory information on the impact of the economic crisis on this migration flow because it's still too early. The scale of the return will be visible, in fact, next month, in April, when usually migrants are going back to Russia. That's true that since January, we saw a kind of decrease of migrants going back to Russia, but usually they don't go back during winter time. And what seems to be really important is that we don't know if it's because of the economic slowdown in Russia. It seems it's also because Russia made mandatory having biometric passports. And in fact, all the Central Asians have now to change their passport in their own countries, and that takes time. So the statement that migrants won't come back to Russia because of the economic crisis, I think it's partly mistaken, because migration are not mechanical, they are societal. And once you create this kind of societal movement, it's very difficult to stop it. Look at Europe in the 50s and the 60s, migrants were welcome. After the 70s, migrants were no more welcome. They continue to come because you just create a kind of societal movement that invite people to leave. And there are several reasons for migrants to continue to go working in Russia, even if the economic situation in Russia really deteriorates. The first one is just the differential of wealth. It has always been more interesting to work in Russia than to try to work in Central Asia, especially because there is no job and there will be no job in Central Asia and rural regions for any moment in the near future. Also because you have a kind of demographic dynamism. You have this new generation of Uzbek citizens who are on the job market and there is no job for them. And you will have even more Tajiks because the demographic transition in Tajikistan is still a kind of ongoing process. You will have millions of new Tajiks who will have to find a job, and they will probably continue to go to Russia or to somewhere else. Then, even if the Russian economic slowdown, it will impact the construction sector, the energy exploitation sector, but there are still many other sectors where Russian citizens won't be interested in taking low-paid and low-prestige jobs, and they will still need a migrant. Probably more will go, as I said, in the shadow economy, but they will continue to go. And then another element is that you have more and more migrants leaving their Central Asia to go to Russia in family. Once you go in family, you don't go back even if the economic situation is less interested. And you have more and more Central Asian migrants who have a Russian passport, and therefore they are also Russian citizens, and they will try to stay in the country. And the last element that makes that probably migrants will continue to stay is that you have two kind of new job sectors that are opening now in Russia, and that usually we don't think about them. The first one is mosque. I mean, Russia is facing the same issues as many European secular countries. Because they are a secular country, they don't really know if they want to take care of training imam for their new mosque, and therefore they are offering jobs in mosque mostly to foreigners. And that's a kind of job sector where especially Tajiks have been growing on. And the second element is that Russia just created this kind of foreign legion system. So foreigners will be able to become contractor of the Russian army for 5 years, and after they will get the citizenship. And it seems there will be a kind of important flow from Tajikistan, especially to go to this foreign legion, which is of course not a good news for Russia, because for Russia and for Central Asia, because we see this kind of growing trend of militia in Central Asia that is something very dangerous. It also means that it will largely, if this trend is confirmed, it will largely change the kind of nature of the Russian army. It will have more and more contractors from foreign countries. It's also 2014, the first year since the end of the first Chechen war, that draft is including conscript from Chechnya, and the number of conscript from Dagestan has been doubled last year. So there is a real big change with the Russian army becoming more and more Muslim and less ethnically Russian. That could probably, if it's continued, have a long-term impact on the way Russia manages its own army. But then globally, moving from the migration to the global economic impact of the Russian crisis in Central Asia, it has been really something tremendous. And Kazakhstan is probably the most concerned because they have to face both the crisis and the Eurasian Economic Union impact. As you know, the national money has been devaluated, the tenge, in early 2014, and it's possible there will be a new devaluation in the months to come. The number of foreign currency bank accounts has been just skyrocketing, which means that you have less and less liquidity on the Kazakh market and more dependency toward the dollars. It means also that Kazakh exports are less competitive than they were a few months ago, which is a bad news for the Kazakh economy. Since February, Astana had to impose restriction on cross-border trade with Russia in order to avoid a flood of Russian cheap product into the market. So that's something that is a kind of unprecedented impact of the crisis over the Eurasian Economic Union. Astana had to reduce its state budget on prestige projects like the Expo 2017. They had to face the fact that Russia has been introducing unilateral measures in the name of it, like the counter-sanction over European food products, for example. So we can see now that this Eurasian Union, which was really Nazarbayev's pet project, is really now less and less legitimized, and that's really changing probably the way the discussion is going on in Kazakhstan over the participation of the country in the Eurasian Economic Union, and that's also influencing the legitimacy of Nazarbayev himself, and that's maybe one of the elements explaining the advanced presidential election. For the other Central Asian countries, especially Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, as I said, of course, the migration or remittances issue is the big one, but that's not the only one. The local money is also going down against the dollar, which is a bad news for the region. The Kyrgyz and the Tajik national banks had to spend about 20% of their foreign currency reserves to try to keep pace, so they are putting themselves in a kind of difficult, dangerous situation. They were hoping that because of the counter-sanction, they will be able to export more of their food product to Central Asia, but because of the devaluation of the rubles, their own products are no more interesting on the Russian market, so they lost on both sides. And that's really the key element also for them, is that they are all afraid of a risk of retreat of Russian investment in the region. And you may know that Russia promised to Kyrgyzstan in the agreement for its accession to the Eurasian Economic Union, it promised $1.2 billion dollar. Clearly, given the state of the Russian economy, that's probably something that will not happen. The same situation, a little bit different from Kazakhstan, for Tajikistan, sorry, with probably the big Russian firms being less and less involved, and that can concern all the countries in the region, with Gazprom kind of retracting of what it promised to invest, with the Russian Electric State Corporation also becoming less and less involved. So that's really the huge impact that the crisis could have in the region. Some conclusion now. We are almost 25 years after the independence, and the Central Asian states are still facing this kind of terrible dilemma that a strong Russia is the problem, but a weak Russia seems to be even worse. And that's a terrible kind of conclusion to have 25 years after independence. And now it's even worse because they have the worst scenario. They have the strong Russia geopolitically in terms of security, but the weak Russia in terms of economics. So the kind of two disadvantage. I think the Central Asian states are really very pragmatic, and they consider that they can manage a strong Russia because they know how to do that. And at least they benefit from a strong Russia economically. If now they have to face a strong and a weak Russia at the same time, they are just losing on all sides. The second conclusion is that the Eurasian Economic Union is really under kind of threat of being unable to function because of the economic crisis and because Russia showed that it will work with unilateral measures in any case, protecting its own economy. But if this Russian-centric regional integration model failed, it was not the perfect model of regional integration. But even if this one failed, then it's also a big issue because there is no really any other alternative that has been proposed to the region. It's a huge issue for Kazakhstan because Kazakhstan is the kind of big loser. But for all of them, they are all afraid that suddenly if Russia's commitment to develop, to invest in the region becomes a purely rhetorical commitment, then the price to pay to this Russian domination is just huge with no kind of positive elements coming, which means that China is more or less the only country coming with a kind of economic proposal to the region. But here also there are so many unknowns on what it really means to the Chinese investment in the region, the price of payback, what are the long-term implication in terms of job creation, are something that are really kind of big question mark for the Central Asian state. And the third conclusion is that we here in the US, we really don't know how to address this dilemma of a strong versus weak Russia. And there is, I think, a real gap between us wishing Russia to be weak and the Central Asian expressing concerns about Russia becoming too weak and therefore also becoming a danger from themselves. And I think, the fact that many here has been rejoicing with the idea that we could harm Russia economically with the sanction or with the economic crisis, we have been unable to offer something to the Central Asian state in exchange for the economic crisis in Russia. So we have been really unable to partner with the Central Asian state and to help them facing the Russian economic situation. And I think that's really something that we should be looking at on the long term, because it's clearly not the US Silk Road. The US Silk Road project is a kind of so long-term project. It may happen in 20, 30 years. The problem for the Central Asian, they are in the 5 to 10 years. What is going on now? What will be Russia's economic project? What will be the solution that the US can propose to both Russia's potential economic collapse, to Russia's revival as a geostrategic power, and to the fact that Russia is totally controlling the information world the information space in this part of the world. And I think on that, unfortunately, we are very short in terms of offering a credible answer to the Central Asian state. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Marlene, right on time. Now we'll turn to Scott Radnitz.
Thank you, David. And I also want to thank Professor Angela Stent for organizing this conference. The question, Central Asia, what's next, is always very apt. And in fact, this question has been asked ever since I have been studying the region. And the conclusion of analysts for the last 25 years, based on the reality, is that 4 of the Central Asian states are predictably predictable, and 1 state, Kyrgyzstan, is predictably unpredictable. But the first part of that is likely to change in the next decade because of 2 likely developments of things that are likely to happen that haven't happened in the last 25 years. One is regime succession in at least 1, but possibly 2 or 3 Central Asian states, and the other one is mobilization from below. I'm going to focus on the first issue mostly in this talk. to try to think a little bit systematically about some of the possibilities for what happens after the current old man leaves the scene and something happens subsequently. The narrative is usually there's either going to be a smooth transition, an agreement among elites like happened in Turkmenistan, or the opposite, which is all-out chaos and civil war. But I think we should also consider thinking about the dynamics of what could happen in between those two scenarios in the black box of regime succession. It's difficult to think about this because all these regimes, besides Kyrgyzstan, are very institutionally centralized, centered around the president. So I think it may be useful to think a little bit about what are some of the power dynamics beyond the president's immediate entourage and politics outside the center, outside the capital. For 2 decades, as we know, informal rules of maintaining power have worked very effectively for maintaining elite interests, that is managing the distribution of resources among elites and protecting elite interests from society. But partly because this has been so effective, from the point of view of elites, they don't have any experience with change or uncertainty. So when the president leaves the scene for whatever reason, there's no reliable mechanism to transfer power or to settle disputes between elites. Even if there is a plan, there's no guarantee that that plan will actually unfold as it's supposed to. So the officials themselves, who are part of the regime or may lay a claim to it, have some idea of how things might unfold after, but they don't know for sure. And that's partly because, I think as Roger mentioned before, people don't want to stick their neck out now and announce themselves as a potential successor. And people aren't sure of the intentions of others, of who might then make a bid for leadership in a situation of some uncertainty. And so where people are hiding, potentially concealing their actual intentions, and people perceive that other people might be concealing their intentions, there's always the possibility for miscalculation. If somebody thinks that they may be the target of another elite faction, then they may want to strike out preemptively with their own elite faction and perhaps arrest somebody or neutralize someone's power in order so that that doesn't happen to them first. And so it's pretty easy to imagine scenarios in which the rules break down and people start to improvise. So what shape does that take? So one useful way, I think, of thinking about Central Asian regimes is as pyramids of corruption. And theoretically, this has been spelled out most elaborately by Henry Hale, a professor in this town, who describes Central Asian regimes as patronal presidencies, so hierarchical networks of corruption with the president at the pinnacle. The key insight of this is that loyalty can be rented but not bought. And this is kind of a useful way of thinking about the dynamics of Central Asian regimes, but it's more useful, I think, in explaining how regimes coalesce and form, especially when there's an election or some mechanism that can present a focal point that other elites can rally around. But upon a sudden breakdown, if there's no designated successor, then there really aren't automatic predictions about how things can be resolved. So one thing, I think, one way to look at the potential dynamics is to look within the current pyramid and elites who are not in the immediate circle of the president, but who orbit around him. And so it may be useful then to look at power differentials among these different elites and elite factions and networks that elites might be able to activate during a crisis. And just, at a very general level, you can see differences between the states in how much power is centralized and how much opportunity there is for different factions to potentially make a bid for power after a succession. So in Uzbekistan, you have kind of a classic unitary pyramid with the president, the Khan, sitting on top and appears to run a very tight ship. But if you go a little bit deeper, you see that there are different factions, sometimes based on regional affiliation, sometimes conflicts between different ministries, like the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Security Services, that are staffed according to principles of regionalism, or at least they used to be. And even though Uzbekistan is a state-controlled economy, you do still have oligarchs of the kind that used to be present in Russia, and to some extent still are, and organized crime figures who are, of course, loyal to the president, but also have the potential to mobilize their own resources if that were no longer the case. Kazakhstan's a little bit different because the economy is much, much larger, and thanks to privatization and energy resources, there are a lot more players, a lot more moving parts. Businessmen who are only loosely affiliated with the president, a larger extended family with different kinds of assets and property that could also be nodes of power. Tajikistan, in one way, looks more like Uzbekistan, very centralized, right, with Rahmon at the peak, but the remit of the central state is limited and doesn't penetrate into all the regions, especially those that were in the opposition during the Tajik Civil War. So these differences, I think matter, right? If you go a little bit, right, if you go deeper than this bird's eye view, you can see that potentially, if this pyramid were to suddenly break down, there are these different fragments of the pyramid are still going to be there as sub-pyramids that could reform or clash in different ways. And not all of these elites are equal, right? Key brokers among some of these factions are going to be critical in signaling whether they are to be followed or whether they're going to support somebody else. And it's these people who are going to determine whether they're going to coalesce into a single pyramid, whether elites are going to subordinate themselves to somebody who all the groups agree should be the new leader, or whether different elites may compete and aspire to lead their own pyramids, either the grand central pyramid or an independent pyramid where they're on top. And a second way of looking at the dynamics is to look not at the elite, but at potential social sources of order. We tend to look at the capitals for the power dynamics, and this is because that's where most of the wealth is concentrated. That's where the media coverage, such as it is, takes place. But it's also worth looking at power in the provinces. All of these countries have strong regional and local identities, and a lot of the current elites that run these countries actually came from some province, right? We're running collective farms or we're running factories somewhere else and then came to the capital. So there is potential power in the regions. There's also less monitoring from the center of what goes on in far-flung parts of the country. I mean, do people in Tashkent really know what's going on in Karakalpakstan? Do people in Dushanbe really know what's going on in Badakhshan? And some of these places also tend to carry resentments due to the fact that they're relatively neglected, right? They don't receive the resources that they believe they deserve. And it also creates opportunities for people in the far-flung provinces to amass their own clienteles. So under the radar, you may not see, but there may be local and informal and potentially charismatic forms of power that are there under the radar that may present the basis of a rival order. And so if we were to kind of game out how these social sources of order might assert themselves, if during a succession, right, the rules start to break down, the central state isn't really enforcing the law, and it becomes clear that independent actors can assert themselves, can grab property or engage in other forces of criminality without being punished, then this can lead to shifts in the perception of central power. And the perception of a weak state is self-fulfilling. People act on the expectations of whether they're going to be punished or rewarded for their actions. So at the local level, the calculations of the likelihood that the central state will be strong in the future, that is, will enforce the law and punish subversive behavior in the regions, that perception is critical and will also determine how local influential actors will react, whether they'll throw their weight behind the central state or whether they'll stake their future with a local contender for power. If the state appears ineffective, then political entrepreneurs might invest more in securing alternative sources of order, whether informal associations of economic entrepreneurs, the mobilization of people power, potentially private militias. Not to get too alarmist about it, but there's something short of an all-out war, and even short of violence, where you can still see local or regional pyramids, political machines, emerging from below and presenting some challenge to the center, whoever ends up in power there, to reassert authority. So from one perspective, you can see this as state breakdown, the central state losing its ability to project its power around the country. From another perspective, from the bottom-up perspective, it's a kind of regime creation. It's kind of hard to imagine now how a local power broker or something like a proto-warlord could emerge in such a centralized system as we see today. But you could do some thought experiments and think about how strong local ties could potentially turn against the center in response to perceived central weakness. One thing you could do is look at second cities, at economic and cultural hubs outside the capital. So these would be places like Osh or Samarkand or Shymkent. You could also look at parts of the country where there are salient differences, ethnic or regional or cultural differences. And again, Osh, Samarkand, Khorog, northern Kazakhstan, obviously. It might make sense to look also at border zones or places where parts of the country might be susceptible to outside patronage or meddling, depending on how you look at it. And again, this could be Osh, Khojand, Merv in Turkmenistan, Shymkent, Khorog, again, northern Kazakhstan. So I mean, I don't mean to make any alarmist claims that these are potentially secessionist regions, but these are alternative nodes of power where you might find elites who might be able to make the kinds of claims, local claims, that could stand up against central claims of authority. It might also be hard now to imagine who could emerge as a leader of a local pyramid. In Kyrgyzstan, of course, there are lots of examples of criminals or local rabble-rousers who have appeared at various times and amassed some kind of authority, social authority, challenging the state, sometimes with greater, sometimes with lesser success. In other states, though, in the other four states, really, where local elites, local independent elites are essentially eliminated, you could look inside the state itself. And even loyal appointees do create their own clientele. This is why central authorities rotate elites in different parts of the country, because if they stay there too long, right, they tend to become too comfortable and maybe become too popular. So these people would be mayors or governors. In a place like Uzbekistan, it might be members of the police or the security establishment who have local roots and might also have local sources of social support. Together then you might find people who are part of the state as part of political machines who have local alliances with loyal businessmen with whom they have some kind of collaboration, local charismatic people, former politicians who still carry some social authority, aggregating their power locally in order to form their own rival order against the central state. So this is, the comments that I made so far are about the kinds of political changes in Central Asia that could happen abruptly. And the trend would be a continuation of long periods of stability punctuated by a sudden and unexpected change. But when we talk about these abrupt changes, we don't know when they're going to happen, we don't know how they're going to happen. It's kind of like predicting earthquakes. We're not very good at that. So I just want to close by talking about two broader social trends that may or may not have political implications, but I think it's worth thinking about how these social trends might interact with potential political changes in the future. And these two things are the deterioration of economic capital and infrastructure, and social trends toward conservatism. So the first thing, the decline of human capital, has been talked about by others over a long period of time, and Roger brought this up briefly, so I'm not going to talk about it in detail. But it's worth paying attention not just to the deterioration of the education system, which is a constant, right? And it's hard to see that they'll turn the corner anytime soon. But also the lack of competent administrators that a modern state needs in order to run things like doctors and engineers and teachers and scientists and bureaucrats, the people that we take for granted that have to be basically minimally competent in order to make a state run. Young people today who buy diplomas, who try to get jobs through connections, and who invest in their skills of trying to advance informally and circumvent the official rules rather than investing in actual education that you would need in a meritocracy, these young people today are unlikely to be able to do the kinds of things that a technically competent administrator must do in a normal state. And so where people seek to join the ranks of the powerful rather than developing skills for bureaucratic competence, there's a vicious circle by which the incentives for honest work decline, educated people leave, And to my mind, young people who are getting educated abroad don't want to come back, and they don't come back unless they have to. So the people that are left behind haven't invested in education and don't have any real hope of developing one, and this leads to further decline because there isn't going to be demand in the country to improve local education systems. So what are the implications then of a hollowed out state and a regime that's detached from society? Probably not favorable, and it's hard to see how this is going to change anytime soon. And then in my last 2 minutes, I'm going to talk about one other trend, which is not inherently political, and that has to do with the fact that Central Asian societies, for the most part, are becoming more conservative. And of course, religiosity is playing a greater role in social life, but I don't mean religiosity per se. What I mean is the invocation and practicing and deepening of tradition, or perceived tradition, as a mainstay of social life to give people meaning and to center people's existence while all around them looks like chaos and corruption. Politicians themselves encourage this, and you see the leaders often rhetorically praising, conservative traditional values as a means of expressing national identity and a force for maintaining order. And Uzbekistan every year declares that there is going to be some year of some special emphasis every year. This year it's the year of elders. Before it's been the year of children or the year of sport or something. But these are all kind of anchoring a national discourse about some kind of traditional values. And what this does is it creates pressures for social conformity that makes it easier to identify potential deviants who might also be considered political threats. This trend is magnified by the poor secular education out there, which isn't able to challenge these traditional beliefs. With less fluency in Russian in the countryside, aside from the migrants who keep up their Russian and come back, you still see a long-term, I think, deterioration of people's Russian. And the lack of access to outside media makes people captive to Central Asian state media, which isn't going to provide a lot of intellectual enlightenment. And here I think actually Russian TV is more of a positive than a negative. Sure, they get the share of propaganda and conspiracy theories, but Russia is still an outlet to the world. And to the extent that people no longer understand or have access to Russian news, they're going to be even more cut off from the outside world. So there are no clear political implications of this. It doesn't mean that after the regime's succession, there's going to be an Islamic takeover, or people are going to favor Sharia law. Central Asian Islam has been, and I think will continue to be, different. But it will mean greater tolerance in society of gender equality, less freedom of choice in lifestyle in general, and these factors might have a greater impact on people's daily lives than what happens in the political system. It's certainly bad for women, and it's bad for political and social, not just freedom, but variation. If there is political competition, the promotion of socially conservative policies will be a potential vote winner. There will be less tolerance for other nationalities and religions. In the next decade or two, many of the remaining ethnic Russians in Central Asia who were already very old in the 90s will die off, and so these will become more and more homogeneous societies. And interestingly, I think President Putin's new anti-Western values might resonate more than before. So Putin's current ideological campaign, however we describe this, which is fairly new, might resonate beyond Russia. So it's framed as Russian civilization standing up against the West, but the values that Putin is promoting are generally retrograde values, which might be attractive to people in Central Asia. Now, this trend in Central Asia has been going on for the last 20 years, whereas it was basically just invented in Russia, right, as Putin's new national discourse. But this might allow Russian politicians, if they continue this discourse, to appeal to Central Asian people in a way that they haven't been able to before, as a common traditional conservative civilization against Western progressive and contemporary values. So my time is up, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to our third panelist, Eric McGlinchey.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for chairing. Thank you, Angela, for inviting me. What a downer, huh? We've had 3 talks now. All 3 of them are somewhat distressing, not in their presentation, but in their message. I wish I could say that I was going to present an upper. I'm not quite sure I will, but maybe a little levity sprinkled in here and there might help. I'd like to begin with a paradox, and the paradox is the following. If you look at Central Asian countries today, the ones that have seen the most political liberalization, the most economic liberalization, are the ones that are currently gravitating towards the region's biggest, meanest, nastiest autocracy, that is Russia. The ones that have seen the least political liberalization, the least economic liberalization, paradoxically, are now gravitating towards Washington. So Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan are being pulled back into Russia's orbit, and Uzbekistan, as I like to give David a little bit of ribbing out now and then, is being pulled back into Washington's orbit. And this recent delivery of 300 armored vehicles to Tashkent is just one indication of growing friendly ties with the United States. So this is strange, right? The kind of inchoate democracies, free markets are moving back towards Russia, and really hard autocracies are moving towards the United States. And Sam Huntington, as much as I dislike his later work, his 1968 Political Order and Changing Societies, he warned us about this, but of course it was the Soviet Union back then. And he said, the weak countries are the ones who may be vulnerable, who may be democratizing, and as a result are most vulnerable, are the ones who are moving maybe towards Moscow, and it's the really autocratic ones that the United States back then was able to do business with. So it's something to keep in mind. History comes and repeats itself, I think, here as well. I'd like to break my comments into 4 sections. Roger did 3, I'll do 4. I'd like to look at Central Asian vulnerabilities, and I'll look along 4 dimensions. 2 of the dimensions you've already heard quite a bit from Scott and Marlene: political vulnerabilities and economic vulnerabilities. The other 2, the balance, we haven't really talked as much about. That's ethnic vulnerabilities and geopolitical vulnerabilities. And the question is, vulnerable with regards to whom? I'm going to focus on Russia this time. A month ago here I was focusing on the United States. This time I'm going to focus on Central Asia's relations with Russia. And the bottom line that I'd like to leave you with, in addition to this idea of the paradox, which is quite unsettling, is that Central Asian countries, with regards to Russia, they're dealing with a much more economically weakened Russia. I think Marlene has already laid that out. I'll do this in a little bit more detail. But at the same time, they're dealing with a politically much more robust Russia, a Russia that is potentially more adventurous in the region than we have seen in previous years. So those are the 2 kind of takeaways here. Let me begin with the political vulnerabilities. And here I think I'm going to lay a little bit of empirical meat on the really fabulous theoretical foundation that Scott just gave us, and discuss how some of these pyramids that he laid out for us, how they play out with the current regimes. And let me begin with Kazakhstan. I actually see Kazakhstan as a country with very high political vulnerability. There's the obvious reason that Nazarbayev is old. He is rumored to be getting older every day. And there's no succession mechanism here. Kazakhstan, and I'll talk about Uzbekistan in a second, but Kazakhstan is actually quite different from the other country that's facing this aging out problem. Kazakhstan has people outside the government who have a lot of money, and people outside the government who probably aren't all that happy with the existing political system. This has really strong implications if you think about Scott's theoretical pyramid model. These are people who, if given the chance, would like to see substantive regime change. And there's precedent for this. This has actually already happened once before in Kazakhstan. They didn't get the regime change, but there was certainly an effort for regime change. So if you look back to the democratic choice of Kazakhstan back in the early 2000s, this was a group of political elites who actually were from within the government, who were backed by economic elites who, of course, had ties to the government, but were relatively independent economic elites who tried to change the system, who tried to potentially overthrow the system. They were too early. Right, so 14 years ago, Nazarbayev was still going to the gym. He wasn't riding on horses without a shirt, but he was still, very robust. Right, they were too early. I don't think they're too early now. I think the chance now exists that these political and economic elites would get together and seek to foment some kind of change. This makes Nazarbayev very vulnerable to Moscow. Moscow can partner with these economic elites should Nazarbayev do something that Moscow doesn't like. So there's a really high degree of political vulnerability. And again, this goes back to the idea that Huntington was writing about in '68. Countries that don't have deeply institutionalized political mechanisms are exactly the countries that are most vulnerable to outside manipulation from other autocratic countries. And I think Kazakhstan is exactly a case illustrating this point. Kyrgyzstan I see as a country of medium political vulnerability. Medium maybe simply because, I think Roger referenced this already when he was talking about coups. I mean, a coup in Kyrgyzstan is not that big of a deal, right? So, I mean, it's vulnerable, but so what, right? So things change. But certainly, if you look at Kyrgyzstan, if you look at the 2010 revolution, Russia's fingerprints were very much on this revolution. If you look at where the political elite went in the weeks and months immediately following the revolution, they went to Moscow. Sure, they talked with people from the United States, but really the attention was towards Moscow. You can really see the influence Moscow had on this country. You have other points of vulnerability. You've got the north-south divide that Moscow has played up in the past. When I was doing field research in Osh in the 2000s, and also actually this came up again when I was there after the Osh riots in 2010. I mean, the Russian presence is there. They're working at a political level. They're doing political party building. There's an ability, there's a capacity of Moscow to really affect things in the south. Right now, things are going okay. So Mirzak Matov was not elected in January as mayor of Osh, and I think that bodes well for the Atambayev government. But Russia nevertheless has a history of fomenting unrest in the south, and I think people are very wary of that. Right now, Atambayev is following the Moscow playbook, joining the Eurasian Economic Union. So I think things right now are stable, but there is the ability of Moscow to reach in. Now, this isn't a leader who's about to age out like the Kazakh case, but nevertheless, this is a leader who is susceptible to pressure from Moscow. Uzbekistan, for me, is one of the more fascinating cases. Karimov is going to age out. He's 77. But here, and this again going back to Scott's model, if we look at the Uzbek political elites, if we look at the Uzbek economic elites, these are people who are wealthy by dint of their relationship to the existing government. They got their wealth from their position in the government, and so they have an incentive to replicate the very structure that made them wealthy in the first place. What this means is, yes, there may be a succession struggle, but they're likely to replicate the same kind of regime that we currently see. So Moscow's hand in Uzbekistan is constrained. Moscow can try to intervene, but ultimately all these people have an interest, maybe it's a papal mechanism that Roger was talking about, in replicating the system so they can remain in economic power, so that they can remain in political power. And I think you see this in what Uzbekistan has done over the past 15, 20 years, has stayed out of the unions that Moscow has tried to promote. They're not in CSTO. They're not in the economic union. Putin is trying to up his game. He went to Tashkent in December. Moscow wrote off $1 billion of debt in December. That's that probably catches people's attention when you write off $1 billion of economic debt. And Karimov, for his part, has said that Russia is no longer a colonial power in the region, but rather a stabilizing force. So you see a little bit of a change of rhetoric, but you really don't see this manifested in Uzbekistan changing its views towards Russia's unions, the CSTO. So Uzbekistan, low political exposure. Tajikistan, I see this as low political exposure as well. And here not because the Tajik government is institutionalized in a high capacity way like the Uzbek government is, but rather because the Tajik government is, in essence, only institutionalized in Dushanbe. That's why I see the exposure is very low. There's a de facto agreement in Tajikistan that if Scott was talking about Badakhshan. Yeah, Badakhshan does whatever Badakhshan does. Rahmon's not going to do anything. I mean, we've seen a couple of cases where Rahmon tried to change this calculus. Rosh, 2010, Gabal, go to Badakhshan in 2012. It didn't work. And I think what we're seeing now is outside of Dushanbe, you're seeing the government maintaining this de facto agreement with the warlords, saying, look, you run your place, I'll run our place. Within Dushanbe, yes, you see growing political power of Rahmon. The IRPT is now completely out of the government. So within Dushanbe, this is a pretty stable government. And I think it'll remain stable as long as it doesn't try to reach out into the regions. So here I see this as a pretty low political exposure vis-a-vis Moscow. So those are the political vulnerabilities. Let me talk briefly about the economic vulnerabilities. And Marlene has already done a really good job laying out the topography here. As far as the migration factor, we're not actually seeing, and I think Marlene's right, we have to wait another month. But right now, we're not seeing a huge drop-off, a change from existing trends. So if you look on the January year-on-year change, as far as Tajikistan, which probably has the highest economic exposure to Russia, there's only been a 2% drop-off from last year as far as the number of migrants in Tajikistan. So about 1 million migrants last year, 990,000 this year. Remittances, just about the same, 1.4 billion for the third quarter of 2014. But you have to keep in mind, and Marlene already drew our attention to this, half of the Tajik GDP is remittances. So there's a massive exposure to Russia in the Tajik case. Kyrgyzstan, there's also a pretty high exposure here as well. Slightly fewer migrants. If you look at the year-on-year January change, there's actually an increase. There's been an increase in the number of Kyrgyz migrants in Russia, up about 3%. There's been a increase in remittances. If you look at the year-on-year change for the third quarter of 2014, from 614 million to 654 million. This is actually kind of an interesting trend. Again, I like to see the data in a month's time, but if you factor the Sochi equation in here, it's slightly surprising that you don't see much more of a drop-off and in some cases an increase. So right now it hasn't hit Kyrgyzstan, it hasn't hit Tajikistan. Perhaps this is the calm before the storm. Couple other points of economic exposure. There is growing Russian foreign direct investment in Kyrgyzstan. Gazprom has purchased Kyrgyz Gaz, so Gazprom completely controls Kyrgyz Gaz at this point. Rus Hydro is now a majority owner of Kyrgyz Hydro, and Rosneft, the Kyrgyz watchers in the room can tell me if anything's changed over the past week, is in bids to buy Manas International Airport. That's a little bit jarring when you think about it. You used to leave Kyrgyzstan, and there were all the U.S. The U.S. planes, and now the whole thing is going to be run by Rosneft. It's a bit jarring. So Kyrgyzstan, definitely a high economic exposure. Uzbekistan, middle to low economic exposure. I won't say no, because if you look at the data, there's actually more Uzbek migrants in Russia than any other Central Asian migrants. So there's about 2.3 million. That number, as in the other cases, is holding rather steady. There's been a slight decrease January this year down to 2.2 million, last year 2.3 million. But not a market change. You'd think there'd be more of a change, but there really hasn't been that much of a change. There has been a decline in remittances, about 9%, from 2.3 to 2.1 million in the third quarter 2014. One thing that we're beginning to see change in the Uzbek case is growing Russian foreign direct investment. Lukoil announced in 2013 that it was going to be investing about $5 billion in Uzbekistan. But I'd urge you to keep in mind that the history of Russian foreign direct investment in Uzbekistan has been strained, to say the least. If you think about Uzdun-Robit, the telecom that was nationalized after it was privatized to Russian investors, Tashkent Sut, same thing, the dairy industry, the big dairy conglomerate in Uzbekistan, sold to Russians and then taken over by the Uzbek government. Subsequently, the history of Russian foreign direct investment in Uzbekistan hasn't been one that's positive from the Russian side. From the Uzbek side, it's been great, right? The Russians, they pay, then they put money in, and then the Uzbeks just take it over again, which is, I suppose, a different kind of growth strategy. But the exposure, I think, at this point is relatively low. Kazakhstan, a middle amount of economic exposure. Marlene really said the main thing that I wanted to say, and I think it's really important, and so I'm just going to emphasize Marlene's point. The Russian ruble floats. Right now, the Kazakh tenge doesn't. And this is a huge problem, a massive problem. As Russian goods are getting cheaper, the pressure on Kazakh goods, both domestic consumption and export, is growing. I honestly don't know how Kazakhstan can remain within this union without a float for the tenge. I think the rumor is that after the presidential election, later, when is the election? Yeah, so 1 month from now, right? So if you have money in tenge, now would be the time to get it out. The rumor is it's going to depreciate after that. But you know, there is some economic exposure growing with the union. So those are the exposures on the political and economic side. Really quickly on the ethnic side, we haven't really talked so much about this, which is, and I think we should pay some attention to this, given that the modus operandi for Russia and Ukraine was defending Russians against those horrible fascists, that's in quotation marks. You could see a similar dynamic potentially in northern Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has the largest Russian ethnic population in Central Asia. About 24% of the population concentrated on that northern border is Russian. So you could imagine a scenario where this was used to justify some kind of growing pressure, maybe even incursion from the part of Russia. I think it's less likely anywhere else in Central Asia. Yes, there is a large Russian population in Kyrgyzstan, about 12%, but you got to get through Kazakhstan to get there. You have the Kant Air Force Base there, but it would be pretty hard to imagine a scenario where that would play. In Uzbekistan, only 3% Russian, Tajikistan, 1% Russian, Turkmenistan, 2% Russian. So the Ukraine-Russian dynamic, ethnic Russian dynamic, I think, maybe in the Kazakh case, not so much in any of the others. The last thing I'd like to say, in my final minute, is just to briefly talk about the geopolitical vulnerabilities. And I think we can dispense with this really quickly. Ukraine had an exit option, has an exit option. Ukraine can go to Europe. Central Asia really can't go anywhere. Central Asia is stuck. You can say, well, Central Asia could go to China. If you talk to Central Asians about China, you'll realize very quickly how and why Central Asians can't go to China. Culturally, and I'm not quite sure what the explanation for this is, but the divide between Central Asians and Chinese is immense. That may change over time, and I could see it changing over time. China also doesn't really have much of a desire politically to intervene in Central Asia. It's fine with the economic engagement. Political engagement is not something it wants to endeavor. So the geopolitical vulnerabilities actually are quite low vis-a-vis their relation with Moscow. Moscow, I think, understands that Central Asia is not going anywhere, and the need to actually intervene, in contrast to the perceived need to intervene in Ukraine, is much lower. So despite the economic vulnerabilities, despite the political vulnerabilities, despite the ethnic vulnerabilities, I really don't see a huge impetus on the part of Moscow to conduct the kind of foreign policy towards Central Asia that we've seen Moscow using in the Ukraine case.
All right, thank you very much, Eric. Thank you, all three of you, for very provocative presentations. I'm going to take the liberty of, as chair, to ask all of you the same question, which springs from comment that Marlene made in her presentation about the weak or strong picture of Russia. There are different narratives out there about Russia and the Russian Central Asian relationship. One being that there's a resurgent Russia and that it's reinvigorating Russian influence within Central Asia. As Eric pointed out, there are, splits in which countries seem to be going, at least for now, into Russia's orbit. The other narrative is that in the long run, Russia's influence in Central Asia is waning. China's is gaining strength for now economically, but after economic often follow security interests. We see that to be the case in other parts of the world where China has economic interests. It's a long process. But I just would like to pose to all three of you the question, what do you see? Let's step out of the very short-term events that are going on now. The migration issue is a long-term issue, but right now there's a lot of hype about the effect of the Russian economy on it, and that's not to be disregarded. The fourth quarter reports of remittances and returning migrants is a lot more dire than the third quarter, and that came out of the Russian National Bank, Central Bank of Russia, excuse me, just a few days ago, both for the year and for the last quarter. And I think that was very predictable. But in the longer run, as you point out, where are Central Asians going to go in terms of labor migration? Their ties to Russia are going to continue. They don't have other choices, and you can challenge that, but I don't see any others. So, but does that entail a stronger Russian security or economic influence over Central Asia? That's just part of the picture. So looking beyond the next 1 to 2 years at these long-term trends, not at what happens on the ground in Ukraine or other actions, foreign policy actions that Russia takes, although that obviously can have an impact. What do you see, how do you assess that relationship in the long term? And just a question for Scott in terms of the scenarios that you posed for succession. I just wonder, in a country like Uzbekistan, I think the provinces are not nearly as outside the control or purview of Tashkent as they might be in Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan. But in a situation of a power vacuum, as we saw in Kyrgyzstan in 2010, things can change very quickly on the ground, and local elites in those places who don't seem to have a lot of power can emerge and keep the capital at bay. So it's really hard to predict that. But if Kyrgyzstan, after 2010, was able to emerge, reintegrate with the South, its South, and that is as you said, the predictably unpredictable country, why wouldn't Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, after even a short-term succession struggle, if they even have them, be able to do the same? So one specific question for Scott, one large question for all three of you.
Well, if I can begin with the large question, I think on the long run, the interaction between Central Asia and Russia will continue to develop for several reasons. First, because as Eric said, the relationship with China, the feeling of a difference between Central Asia and China is so huge that it will probably take even more time to overcome it. And seen from Central Asia, there is no really kind of interest looking south. There is no kind of cultural trend to consider that the link with Afghanistan is something important. It may change, but still, I think even if migration can develop with Turkey, for example, or with the Emirates, which are also kind of possible destinations, I think the links with Russia will still be the main one. So what we will see emerging is a kind of maybe a more balanced relationship also, if we think on the kind of 20 to 30 years. So we are used to see Central Asia as Russia's near abroad, and I often say that Russia can also become Central Asia's near abroad. Demographically and in terms of migration. If you look at the demographic projection we have for mid-century, you will have about 90 million Central Asians and 120 million Russian in the best case. So, you have two regions that will be demographically more and more equal. So the long-term run, I think, is the one we see, in fact, in Europe with this southern part of the Mediterranean, is that migration will continue. Russia will become a more and more multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious country with several millions of Central Asians being kind of the link, becoming Russian citizen and being part of the links between the two regions. So I think that's the long-term destiny of both countries to remain linked, but that doesn't mean that the political control, the geopolitical control of Russia over Central Asia will be maintained. I think it will be drastically changed in the decades to come, probably.
So I think on your first question, we have to be careful not to impose Western perceptions of Russia on Central Asians. And I think that can be captured in 3 words which we consider ridiculous and don't utter here anymore. Russian soft power, which is a real and existing thing in Central Asia. Central Asians, apart from economic opportunities in Russia, also love Russian television and Russian music and Russian movies and Russian products. And if they could vote, and if Putin were running for office, they might elect him. The taking of Crimea and Russia's actions in eastern Ukraine are perceived very differently in Central Asia than they are here. Of course, they're getting their information from Russian television, by and large, but there's a lot of diversity of views about whether Russia was right or wrong in doing so, and even some very intelligent, educated Central Asians that have access to Western media don't think that the Russian seizure of Crimea was such a bad thing. So Russia's always going to be there, and especially as China exerts economic influence, Russia's kind of a safe place to go, you know, literally and metaphorically. And then on the second question about parts of the country that might elude the central state's grab, I think in Uzbekistan in particular, there is a part of the country that has a lot of basis for rival economic and cultural influence, and that is Bukhara and Samarkand together, which is still perceived in Tashkent as a different region and as a competitor to Tashkent elites. And informally, you talk to people in Tashkent, and there's a lot of some sniping and some resentment against what's perceived as increasing power, increasing mobility of people from the Tajik-speaking part of the country in politics in Tashkent. So it's hard to predict, what the dynamics would be, but there is the possibility that there could be rival networks that don't agree with whatever is imposed from Tashkent. It doesn't mean that this is going to lead to secession or civil war, and as you mentioned, in Kyrgyzstan, even with a very weak central state, they were able to bring Osh back into the fold. So what I'm talking about is more that these rival groups might be part of negotiations about the nature of the state. That is, whoever comes to power in Tashkent would have to bargain, would have to make some deals informally with the people who have power in other regions. So it doesn't mean the country will break up, but it does mean that power informally might have to be decentralized in order to maintain coherence of the state.
I'll be quick, and I'm going to slightly disagree, I think, with Marlene and Scott. I think, and that the point of the disagreement will come up in a second. But I think the long-term relation with Russia in Central Asia is the answer to that is going to, in a large part, going to depend on what happens in Russia. If Russia is a quote-unquote normal country, then I think the relationship will be a good one. If it increasingly becomes abnormal, there's going to be lots of incentives to move away from Russia. And so this is where the point of disagreement comes in with, I think the soft power, yes, is present, but is contingent on some pretty profound economic variables. There's no quicker way to piss off a Kyrgyz trader or a Kazakh trader or a Tajik trader than, or for that matter, an Uzbek trader, if you think about the riots in 2004 in eastern Uzbekistan, than to threaten their livelihood. And if this Eurasian Economic Union threatens their livelihood, then Russian soft power is not going to be all that strong. In fact, people are going to move the other way. It also depends on what happens with China. The Chinese economy isn't looking so good right now, so Chinese influence could wane. It also depends on what's going to happen with Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. What if Iran, Roger was alluding to this in his comments, what if Iran suddenly becomes a normal, quote-unquote, country, and there's an outlet to Iran? This is a huge market, and it's a market that opens up potentially a lot of other markets. So there are other avenues for Central Asia should things change in the surrounding countries. That means both in changing in Russia, changing in the countries to the south. So I think there is a lot in play right here, and I wouldn't assume a continuation of soft Russian power if there's a constellation of variables like the ones I just outlined.
All right, thank you. Questions from the audience? Farouk?
I'm Farouk Nazarov, Central Asia Fellow at the George Washington University. Thank you very much for all three exciting presentations. I would like to raise some points. The first related to Scott. I was surprised that you mentioned oligarchs and organized crime in Uzbekistan, and also you mentioned the Russian language, actually the deterioration of the Russian language in the rural areas. The first one is actually after the war on oligarchs in 2010, things have changed with the oligarchs. So they either keep low profile or they basically non-existent. So things completely changed in this regard. And with organized crime, I would say that in Uzbekistan can be characterized by disorganized crime. That basically there is no kind of pattern, and the government heavily controls. In a way, it's a police state, and it's hard to identify this kind of pattern of organized crime. With regard to the Russian speaking or the Russian language, I would say it's quite the opposite since 2005, as research shows, that basically more people in rural areas would like to give their children to Russian schools and to educate them in Russian because they realize there is a need for the Russian language. Even in Soviet times, there was no such need because they were in rural areas in cotton fields and they didn't see much of this need. And my question to all three speakers is about disconnect of actually knowledge in the region. So basically, Marlene was talking about some kind of micro perspective. Scott and Eric were talking about macro perspective. But we are lacking, I think, the meso perspective in the region. We are really lacking understanding what's going on. For example, we mentioned a lot the word elite. What we do know about elites? Not much. We mentioned a lot about public officials or bureaucrats, like mid-level. What we do know about them? Almost nothing. And also about companies. So we talk a lot about companies and businesses, but if you look at literature, you can see there is nothing about how companies actually interact with each other. So I would really would like to know your perspective on this issue about the meso perspective, which I think is actually disconnecting our knowledge from this micro labor migrants perspective, let's say, and then macro perspective, talking about the top of the pyramid. Thank you.
Yeah, those are two excellent points. So when it comes to seeking out within Uzbekistan their quasi-independent actors, it's a game of it's bulldogs struggling under the proverbial carpet, right? And you have to interpret news stories that you hear to try to figure out what's actually going on. And so you're right that in the last, I think the last 5 years or so, not the last 10 years, right, it appears as if there's been a consolidation and that state actors closer to the president have been able to consolidate power and edge out some people who appeared to be distancing themselves. But it's always a matter of degree. Not everybody is in lockstep, right, with the head of state. And there are always going to be factions. There are always going to be different sorts of competition between elites over property. And there is still turnover. And if you read, if you read the things that happen without clear explanations, you can see, right, that there's still stuff behind the scenes. It's hard to often name these people, and even harder to identify exactly how much power they wield. So we're always engaged in this kind of game of speculation. But what I want to emphasize is, as unitary as a pyramid might appear from outside, if you go a little bit closer, you do see, right, that there are some moving parts. The second question about Russia, so I agree. A lot of people in rural areas realize the benefits of Russian and the benefits of sending their children to Russian schools, and I know people who've made that decision. But the quality of Russian education in the provinces is also deteriorating, and not everybody can afford to send their children to Russian schools, and there might not be enough Russian schools available to meet the demand. And so despite that countervailing trend, I still think you do see the trend of a deterioration of Russian knowledge, despite what I argued earlier is an inherent attraction to Russia.
If I I may answer on the question about knowledge issue, because I think that's really something important. I think we are really at a turning point in terms of generation and the kind of knowledge we have on the region. I mean, it's more and more difficult to work in the region. Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan are more or less close. Tajikistan is in the process of becoming more and more difficult. We see it everywhere, even in Kyrgyzstan. We see also this kind of generational change where you have less and less Western scholars and more local scholars. So we have to kind of pass also the knowledge production will come more and more from local scholars based in the region and from Central Asian scholars outside of the region. And I think here, the four of us, we are kind of, that the last years, you will see a panel with people who are not originally from the region, because clearly the next generation will be majoritarily, so we see the kind of Central Asianization of Western research. So the majority of new people working on Central Asia are very often from the region. And that's I think, kind of last change, and we can make, still hoping that we will be able to get the kind of information you are mentioning, because it's clearly, compared to what we were able to get in the 90s, the region is in fact more closed and more opaque for research than it was a few years ago. And probably the only way to kind of answer to that is to promote local researchers.
So on the mid-level elites part, I think it's a good question. I think, in an 18-minute presentation, one is a little bit nervous to dive into the weeds there, but I think you're right, we should dive into the weeds. And I'll just give you one example to illustrate a point I was trying to make in the Kazakh case. Take Vladimir Kim, Kazakhstan, billionaire, $1 billion investment in Uzbekistan, taken over his investment in 2 cement factories, taken over Visor Group's investment, taken over by the Uzbek government. It's an interesting case. You've got a Kazakh business organization taking a sovereign Central Asian state to court at the World Bank, and I would imagine making life a little bit difficult for the Nazarbayev government. So I think your point's well taken, and I think for the Kazakh government, this is a kind of a scary phenomenon. Now, you may say that Kim has a lot of close connections to the Kazakh government, and you'd be right. But at the same time, this guy's got a lot of money, and he's one among several people in Kazakhstan who have a lot of money. And these are the kinds of people, the elites that you rightfully said we should put some faces on, that can play a role. They can play a role internationally in the bilateral Kazakh-Uzbek relationship, but they can also play a huge role domestically. Imagine what the political landscape would look like if someone like Vladimir Kim said, you know what, I'm not really too happy with this autocratic system. I'm going to throw, say, $700 million behind some person or some candidate or some grouping of politics. This is the kind of change that I think we could potentially see in Kazakhstan that we're not likely to see in Uzbekistan.
Slightly less than the Koch brothers, right? Is that
Slightly.
So let's take some more questions. How about MJ, Sebastian, and Eric? We'll take 3 together. We can get more in that way.
Hi, thank you. I'm a graduate student here in Professor Abramson's class. And Marlene, you mentioned how Russia is still the guarantor of security in both the economic and political sphere. And I was wondering, and of course, worst case scenario, we do already know that IS, for example, has a presence in the Central Asian region, and in a worst-case scenario, if that deteriorates the security situation there, who do you think would be more likely to intervene to get IS out or destroy IS, the United States or Russia? Thank you.
And then over here.
Thank you. Sébastien Perrault, Central Asia Program at George Washington University. When we talk about vulnerabilities in Central Asia, we usually talk a lot about political vulnerabilities, economic, ethnic, and they are obviously real. I mean, I don't deny that. But what about social vulnerabilities? Here, I mean, I'm talking, for example, about the failure of education, the failure of healthcare systems, the failure of the state to maintain transport infrastructure to enable people going from a point A to point B to work or to visit family or whatever. And I mean, each time I'm in Central Asia, most of people I meet with, and here I'm thinking about people on the street. actually a huge majority of them don't talk about the so-called spillovers from Afghanistan or, I mean, the president's succession. I mean, they would talk about all these difficulties they face in their daily life. And it seems to me that these are precisely these difficulties which make resentment growing in Central Asia. And sorry, but I will be here a little bit provocative, but most of the time, when you talk with people, and contrary to what a lot of people think in Western countries, they don't talk, I mean, people in Central Asia don't necessarily talk about democracy. They talk about, I mean, their daily life difficulties. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that they're happy to be in such authoritarian regime. But what I mean here is that they focus on their daily life, and this explains, by the way, why there is such nostalgia for the Soviet regime in Central Asia now. So I would be interested in having your opinion about that. Am I overestimating the risks related to these social issues, which seem to me, again, one of the main risks that Central Asia is facing? Thank you.
Thanks. And then Eric, can you raise your hand again?
I'm Eric Rudenschold from USAID. I'd actually really like to thank the panel for a lot to chew on, a lot of very good pieces of information and arguments. I'd actually just give a few comments to bolster some of the things you've said. The issue of labor migrants, obviously these are huge numbers, but looking at the fragile economies of the region, any disruption in flow of remittances back can have a really big impact on local economies. I think in terms of local politics, if we look at the results of the Kyrgyz local elections a couple of years ago, we saw the rise of local and regional parties really to the really shutting out all of the national parties. And now you're starting to see, as we move towards the new election cycle, sort of the co-optation of some of those local parties into the national parties, which is very interesting. Eric, interesting, Atambayev holds that he is not going to run for president again. So that really poses an interesting dynamic for Kyrgyz politics, and you're absolutely right about getting your money out of Kazakh banks. The National Bank apparently reports a run on its reserves now to the tune of about $600 million in the last 2 months.
Okay. Who wants to go? Do you want to start?
Sure. Eric, thanks for your points, and Sebastian, thanks for your comments. Sebastian, I think you're right. I phrased this in the terms of 4 vulnerabilities, and I clearly left out the social vulnerability. And I know you're calling all of us on this, and I think rightfully so. There's variation here too, and actually Kazakhstan comes out pretty well on this score. If you look at, I haven't looked at the data in about a year or so, but if you look at hospital beds per capita, if you look at electricity usage per capita, if you look at any of these typical, infant mortality, Kazakhstan is doing pretty well, doctors per capita. The places that are really struggling are Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. I frankly have no idea about Turkmenistan. I don't know if anybody does. Probably pretty bad, I would imagine. And so the question then is, what's happening in these countries? And this is where I actually, and this actually gets to, is it MJ? It was your first question a little bit. I've seen again and again in places like Akterek on the south side of the lake in Kyrgyzstan, and Kokand, and places. What you see is a lot of local religious organizations, generally Islamic organizations, playing a much more active role as far as and you see this in Osh, for example, with the Sadikjan Kamala, the Kamala family, historically has played a very large role, and this actually is a moderating force, I think, for Islam in the region. The fear of kind of ISIS and radical Islam is, to a large degree, I think it's being mitigated precisely because of the weak state. People are turning towards these charity organizations, and you see a lot of civil society coming up around these organizations. So I look at Islam, and I'm not particularly concerned. I see this as a way of dealing with some of these vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities, in a quite productive and positive way for the most part.
Okay. Who wants to go? Do you want to start?
Sure. Sure. Eric, thanks for your points, and Sebastian, I think you're right. I
Yes, so just very briefly, to merge both Sebastian's question with the issue of local politics, I think these two actually intersect. Where states are highly centralized, where resources all move from the periphery to the center, local resentments and feelings of deprivation in the regions can then translate into support for local providers of services and public goods, either actual or potential. Not necessarily of a religious nature, but people who invoke regionalism and appeal to their local roots and local support bases that may have political implications by offering people an alternative to central rule. And I also just want to thank Eric and the other Eric for the financial advice I've gotten today, that I'm going to make a run on my Kazakh bank and take all my tenge out today.
Yeah, on the question about the Islamic State, I think the Central Asian states are used to kind of overemphasize the threat coming from any kind of Islamic narrative, and that's what they are doing now with the Islamic State. So, I mean, it's relatively a few number of Central Asians who are interested in following or supporting the Islamic State. It's it's a kind of fashionable trend, mostly among Central Asian diaspora and among the migrants community in Russia. It's relatively low level in Central Asia itself, and I think if the Islamic State is, I mean, people in the Islamic State are interested in targeting a country, it would be Russia and not Central Asia itself. Many migrants will go, I mean, those who have been sent to Syria are mostly migrants who can try to go back to Russia, not to Central Asia. So I think it's a little bit kind of overlooked at the kind of media hype. You can see emerging social mobilization in Central Asia in the name of Islam, but they will be relatively different. They will be emerging in the name of Islam, but Islam being understood as a kind of tool for social justice in very localized, specific cases against the local government and the local corrupt practices. It's not the narrative about the caliphate and the kind of internationalized, geopoliticized jihad. That's really two different things. And in terms of intervention, I mean, the US are not interested in intervening, and no one will invite them to intervene in the region. The real issue that could emerge potentially in case of any kind of localization, I mean, local conflict is Russia able and willing to intervene? And clearly, since the 2010 situation in Osh, many things have changed inside the Collective Security Treaty Organization. First, Uzbekistan is out, which makes things easier for Moscow because they will have to manage only a country that could potentially say yes to an intervention, and they have been training better their kind of small, localized, rapid intervention forces. But that doesn't mean neither that Russia will be able to intervene or even willing to intervene, and they can also decide to let the local regimes having to deal with their own kind of localized insurgencies or social instabilities.
I think we have time for one or two very quick questions and answers. Kyrgyzbek, any more? Brian. Raise your hand, Kyrgyzbek.
Thank you. Kyrgyzbek Kanunov, a humble citizen of Tajikistan. I'd like to make some comments and then finally
we just have a couple of minutes. So
okay, no problem.
So
I think it's important to mention here is that some of the Central Asian countries, in Tajikistan in particular, the fact that we have to deal with Russia all the time is not a matter of choice. I would rather say that it's a matter of the absence of choice. And if we're talking or thinking about widening the cooperation with Western countries, it's for the Western countries, I think it's important also to clearly declare about their plans on cooperating with Central Asian countries, because as far as, for example, Tajikistan is concerned, until today, there's no any serious cooperation agreement signed between the United States and Tajikistan. And the Tajik society, yes, they have a clear understanding of how this cooperation can be developed. Otherwise, regardless of all the limitations that the Tajik citizens have in regards with cooperation with Russia, we have no choice but dealing with Russia only. And of course, we've seen a number of attempts from Central Asian countries in trying to diversify their partnership with other countries. And the recent example is, for example, the Kyrgyz president, after meeting with President Putin, had a tour in Europe where he expressed his desire to develop close cooperation with European countries. So I think the question here is, hopefully by the end of this event, we'll have some understanding of what is next. But the question is, how can we widen and develop a closer cooperation with Western countries, and particularly the United States? Thank you.
Thanks. And Brianne, can you raise your hand?
Hi, Brianne Todd from the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. Many thanks to the panel for the comprehensive overview that you've given this morning. Just a quick question. I think we've covered all the countries in depth except for Turkmenistan. And I would love to hear from the entire panel what your thoughts are on what's currently going on there and what we could possibly expect to see in the long term from Turkmenistan. I know I didn't ask for much.
In 20 seconds each.
Well, for my side of the story, Turkmenistan, even if it's very much isolated from Russia economically compared to the other and with very little migration, it still has been marked by the Russian economic slowdown, and the local money has been also devaluated and so on. So even in the case of Turkmenistan, you see an impact of what is going on in the region and in Russia. So which means that even if you are an isolated country, you still are part of a wider region.
I don't have much to add except to say that Sebastian Peruz wrote a book about Turkmenistan. He's in the room, so he might be a good person to ask. But this is a problem, right? Turkmenistan is essentially a black hole, even for people who study Central Asia. There isn't much reporting out of there, and this is a problem. And this is something that we collectively should try to remedy however we can.
I actually have two things to say about Turkmenistan. The first is, I think if you look at everything that's going on, everything points to Turkmenistan trying to diversify away from Russia. Everything suggests that Turkmenistan should be looking at other partners. And the second thing I have to say is that Berdi Buhamedov needs horse riding lessons.
And on that note, I want to thank the panelists for their great presentations and you for your questions, and we're going to move to lunch.